The chains rattled against the stone floor, and every guard in the hall took one step back. Mira Doyle pressed herself against the cold wall, her broom forgotten in her hand, as the beast passed through the corridor like a moving storm. Its fur was black as burnt wood, its eyes glowed a pale silver, and its shoulders were higher than most grown men. The guards called it the Warwolf. The pack called it a curse wrapped in flesh. Mira had heard the stories since she was a small child, whispered around dying fires, about the creature that obeyed only one master and destroyed everyone else who came near it. She had never seen it up close before tonight. She wished she still hadn't. The beast stopped mid-stride, its head turned, slow and deliberate, toward the narrow space where she stood frozen. The torches on the wall flickered, throwing shifting light across its scarred face. Mira's heart pounded so hard she thought the sound alone might give her away. She had been warned 100 times never to look directly into its eyes, never to make a sound near it, never to exist in its path. She had broken every one of those rules, just by being here. A guard named Otto grabbed the chain tighter and yanked, cursing under his breath. "Move," he hissed at the wolf, though his voice cracked with fear rather than command. The beast did not move. It kept staring at the girl pressed into the shadows, and for one terrible heartbeat, Mira believed this was how her life would end, in a servant's corridor, cleaning up after a king who did not know her name, killed by the one creature nobody in the pack could control. Then, footsteps, heavy, sure, unhurried. The kind of footsteps that made rooms go silent before the person speaking even opened their mouth. Kane Voss, Alpha King of the Ashwood Pack, rounded the corner with his second-in-command close behind him. He was tall in the way that made other men feel smaller, just standing near him, with dark hair pushed back from a face that rarely showed anything close to warmth. His eyes swept the hallway once, cataloging everything in an instant: the frozen guard, the still beast, the terrified girl flattened against the wall like she was trying to disappear into the stone itself. "What is this?" Kane said. It wasn't a question. It was an order disguised as one. "My Lord Alpha," Otto stammered. "The beast just stopped. It won't move. I don't know why." Kane's gaze slid past his guard and landed on Mira. She felt it like a physical weight, pinning her in place more effectively than any chain could have. She was used to being invisible in this pack. Servants like her were meant to be seen only when needed, and forgotten the rest of the time. But under the Alpha King's stare, invisibility felt like a luxury she had just lost forever. "You," Kane said, "step forward." Every instinct in her body told her to run. But running from an Alpha King was not a choice anyone truly had. Mira set down her broom with shaking hands and stepped out of the shadow, into the flickering torchlight, in full view of the beast that had, according to every story she had ever heard, never once shown mercy to a stranger. The moment she moved, the Warwolf's ears shifted forward. It took one step toward her, and the chain in Otto's hand pulled taut with a sharp metallic snap. Otto stumbled forward, nearly losing his footing, his face draining of color. "Hold it," Kane snapped. "I'm trying, my lord. It's not listening to the chain." Mira did not know why her feet stopped moving toward Kane, and instead angled, almost against her will, toward the beast. She told herself later that it was fear making her legs unsteady, that she had simply lost her balance in the wrong direction. But in that moment, it felt like something else entirely, like the air between her and the wolf had turned thick and pulled her forward the way a current pulls a leaf downstream. "Girl," Kane said, a warning edge cutting into his voice now. "Stay where you are." She froze immediately, chest rising and falling too fast. The Warwolf did not stop. It closed the last few feet between them with a silence that should have been impossible for a creature its size, and then it lowered its massive head toward her open palm. Nobody in the hallway breathed. Mira did not know what instinct made her lift her hand instead of pulling it away. Her fingers brushed against the fur just above its snout, and the beast let out a low sound, not a growl, something closer to a sigh, and closed its eyes. "Get back," Kane ordered, already moving forward, one hand reaching for the girl's shoulder to pull her away from danger. But before he could reach her, the Warwolf did something that made his hand freeze in midair. It knelt. Slowly, deliberately, its front legs bent and its massive body lowered, until its head rested near the floor in front of Mira's worn shoes. The chain in Otto's hand went slack, forgotten entirely, as the guard stared with his mouth open. Kane stopped walking. His second in command, a broad-shouldered man named Corwin, made a sound like he had forgotten how to speak. For 3 years, that beast had bitten through leather straps meant to hold it. It had thrown grown warriors across training yards without effort. It had refused every hand extended toward it, including, on more than one cold morning, the hand of the Alpha King himself. It knelt for no one. It trusted no one. It had been raised in chains and pain, and everyone in the pack who worked near it understood, without needing to be told twice, that the Warwolf did not kneel. Yet here it was, head bowed low, in front of a servant girl who cleaned kennels for scraps of bread. "What did you do?" Kane demanded, his voice quieter now but somehow more dangerous for it. "Nothing, my lord," Mira whispered, her hand still resting on the beast's head, afraid that if she moved it, something terrible would happen. "I didn't do anything, I swear it. I was only trying to get out of its way." Kane studied her for a long moment. She was small, thin in the way that came from never having quite enough to eat, with dark hair pulled back in a simple braid, and clothes patched more times than they were whole. She did not look like someone capable of tricks or hidden power. She looked like exactly what she was, an Omega girl from the lowest rank of the pack, someone whose name he likely would not have known an hour ago. And yet his Warwolf, the beast that had cost him 3 trainers and had nearly killed a 4th, was kneeling in front of her like she was pack royalty. "Bring her to the Great Hall," Kane said finally, turning on his heel, "and bring the wolf. It seems," he added, glancing back once at the strange sight behind him, "we have questions that need answering." Mira's stomach dropped. Being noticed by an Alpha King was never good news for someone like her. Being noticed because of the most feared creature in the entire territory was somehow worse. Otto reached for the chain again, more out of habit than actual control, since the beast clearly was not interested in being handled by him at all. It rose from its kneeling position slowly, its silver eyes flicking once more toward Mira, before it turned to follow the guards down the corridor. She noticed, with a strange twist in her chest, that it kept looking back at her every few steps, as if checking that she was still there, still following, still real. The Great Hall of Ashwood Pack was a place Mira had only ever seen from the doorway, usually while carrying firewood or emptying ash bins before dawn, long before anyone important was awake to notice a servant moving through the shadows. Tonight it was lit with a dozen torches, and every senior member of the pack seemed to have gathered the moment word spread that the Warwolf had knelt. She stood near the center of the room, flanked by 2 guards who clearly did not know whether to treat her as a prisoner or a guest, while pack elders murmured to each other and stared at her like she had grown a second head. The Warwolf lay near her feet, calm now, in a way none of them had ever witnessed, its massive body curled almost protectively close to hers. Kane sat in the high seat at the end of the hall, one hand resting on the arm of the chair, studying the scene in front of him with narrowed eyes. Beside him stood a woman with sharp cheekbones and cold, calculating eyes, dressed in fine dark fabric that marked her as someone of importance. Mira did not know her name yet, but she would learn soon enough that this was Celine Ashby, a woman with her own plans for a seat beside the Alpha King, and plans that did not include unexpected servant girls stealing attention in the Great Hall. "Explain yourself," Kane said, his voice carrying easily across the silent room. "I have nothing to explain, my lord," Mira said, keeping her eyes low, the way she had been trained to since she was old enough to understand her place in the pack. "I was cleaning near the kennels. I saw the wolf in the hallway, and tried to stay out of its path. That is all that happened." "That is not all that happened," Kane said. "That beast has never allowed a stranger within arm's reach, without attempting to remove that arm. And you claim it simply decided, on its own, to kneel before you." "I don't know why it did what it did," Mira answered honestly. "I have no explanation, my lord. I only know I did nothing to cause it." A murmur rippled through the gathered elders. Celine's eyes narrowed further, studying Mira with an intensity that made the girl's skin prickle with unease. "Perhaps," Celine said smoothly, "the girl carries some scent, some trick learned from wherever she truly comes from. Servants are not always what they claim to be." "I have lived in this pack since I was born," Mira said, a flare of quiet defiance breaking through her fear for just a moment. "I have no tricks. I have no hidden gifts. I clean floors and kennels, because that is the work given to me." Kane rose from his seat and walked slowly down the steps toward her, his boots echoing against the stone. The Warwolf's head lifted at his approach, ears flattening slightly, a low warning rumble building in its chest that stopped the moment Kane halted a respectful distance away. "It is protecting you," Kane said quietly, more to himself than to her, studying the beast with something close to disbelief. "It has never protected anyone, not even me, on the days I bled in front of it." Mira did not know what to say to that. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, aware of every set of eyes in the hall watching her, weighing her, deciding in real time whether she was a threat, a curiosity, or something else entirely. "You will remain in the pack house tonight," Kane said finally, straightening, "under guard. Tomorrow we will determine what this means, and whether you pose any danger to this territory." "And the wolf, my lord?" Otto asked carefully from the back of the hall. Kane glanced down at the beast, which had settled its head back near Mira's feet the moment the conversation paused, refusing to look anywhere else. "The wolf," Kane said slowly, "stays with her. It seems that is the only place it intends to be." The hall erupted into hushed conversation the moment the words left his mouth, elders leaning toward each other, whispering theories and warnings, and suspicions that Mira could feel pressing against her from every direction. Celine's expression had gone carefully blank, though the tightness around her eyes told a different story, one of calculation and quiet, simmering anger. Mira stood alone in the middle of it all, a servant girl who an hour ago had been sweeping floors and hoping to avoid notice for one more uneventful night. Now the most feared creature in the territory lay curled beside her feet like a guardian. The Alpha King was watching her, like she might unravel some secret he had spent years trying to solve, and every powerful person in the room had suddenly decided she was worth paying attention to. She did not know, as the guards led her toward a small room in the pack house with the Warwolf padding silently at her side, that this single moment in a dim hallway had already begun to change the course of her entire life. She only knew that for the first time she could remember, she was not invisible, and that terrified her far more than the beast ever had. Outside, the moon rose high and pale over Ashwood territory, and somewhere in the shadows of the great hall, Celine Ashby watched the girl disappear down the corridor with the wolf beside her, already turning over the beginnings of a plan in her sharp, calculating mind. Whatever this girl was, whatever strange pull she held over the beast no one could tame, Celine intended to find out, and if it threatened her own place beside the Alpha King, she intended to end it before it could grow any further. Mira woke before dawn, the way she always did, except this time, she did not wake in the narrow servant's cot she had slept in since childhood. She woke on a low bed in a small guest room of the pack house, sunlight barely touching the horizon outside the shuttered window, and the first thing she saw when she opened her eyes was a pair of pale silver ones staring back at her from the floor. She sat up so fast her head spun. The Warwolf had not left. It lay stretched across the doorway of the room, exactly where the guards had left it the night before, as though guarding her from anyone who might try to enter, or perhaps keeping her from leaving. Either way, it had not slept, or if it had woken the instant she stirred. "You're still here," she said quietly, her voice rough with sleep. The beast's ears flicked toward her at the sound, but it did not move otherwise, simply watched her the way it had watched her all night, patient and unblinking. A knock came at the door a moment later, sharp and businesslike. Mira scrambled to straighten her clothes and hair before answering, though the door opened before she reached it. Corwin, the Alpha's second in command, stood on the other side, his broad frame filling the doorway, his expression unreadable. "The Alpha wants you in his study," Corwin said. "Now." Mira's stomach twisted, but she nodded and followed him out, the Warwolf rising immediately to pad along beside her without being asked. Corwin eyed the beast warily as they walked, keeping a careful distance, the kind of distance every experienced pack member had learned to keep around the creature over the years. "How long have you worked with it?" Mira asked, mostly to fill the tense silence. 3 years, Corwin said. "Long enough to know it's never done anything like what it did last night. Long enough to be careful around you now, too. if I'm honest. I'm not dangerous, she said. Didn't say you were, Corwin replied. We're just careful. There's a difference. They reached a heavy wooden door at the end of a quiet corridor, and Corwin knocked twice before pushing it open. Cain Voss stood near a tall window, his back to the room, hands clasped behind him, looking out over the training grounds, where a handful of warriors were already sparring in the pale morning light. He did not turn immediately when the door opened. Leave us, he said to Corwin, who nodded and stepped back into the hallway, closing the door behind him. Mira stood near the entrance, unsure whether to sit, unsure whether she had even been given permission to move at all. The Warwolf settled itself near her feet, calm despite the tension thick enough to taste in the air. Sit, Cain said finally, turning from the window and gesturing to a chair across from his desk. Mira obeyed, perching carefully on the edge of the seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Tell me your name, he said, your full name, not what the servants call you in passing. Mira Doyle, my lord. Doyle, he repeated it slowly, as though testing the weight of it. I don't know that name. Who are your parents? My mother died when I was young, Mira said. I never knew my father. I was raised in the servant quarters by whoever had time to look after me. I've worked here my whole life, my lord. There's nothing unusual about me, I promise you that. Cain studied her for a long moment, the same searching look he had given her in the great hall the night before, as though he could find the answer to his questions simply by staring hard enough. There is something unusual happening, he said, whether or not you understand it yourself. He walked around the desk and sat, gesturing toward the beast lying quietly at her feet. Do you know his name? Mira shook her head. I only ever heard him called the Warwolf, my lord. I didn't know he had another one. Fenric, Cain said. That was the name given to him by the trainers who first brought him into this pack, 6 years ago, as a pup taken from a rogue territory during a border conflict. He was young then, barely more than a cub, and he was treated the way rogue wolves treat outsiders they consider a threat rather than family. He came to us already broken by cruelty, before he ever understood what kindness might have looked like. Mira glanced down at Fenric, who had gone very still at the sound of his own name, his silver eyes fixed on Cain, with an intensity that looked almost like old pain resurfacing. He was trained through fear, Cain continued, his voice quieter now, less like a king delivering facts, and more like a man recounting something that troubled him. Every trainer who worked with him believed that discipline had to come before trust, that trust was something earned through obedience, rather than given freely. By the time I inherited responsibility for him, the damage had already been done. He does not respond to gentleness because he has rarely been offered any. He does not trust hands reaching toward him because hands reaching toward him have too often caused him harm. That's horrible, Mira said, before she could stop herself, then immediately lowered her eyes, unsure if speaking so freely to an Alpha King was permitted. It is, Cain agreed simply, surprising her. I have tried, over the years, to undo some of what was done to him. I've had limited success. He tolerates me. He obeys my commands in battle because that instinct was carved into him too deeply to remove, but he has never, not once in 3 years under my direct care, shown affection toward anyone, not toward me, not toward any trainer, any guard, any pack member who has approached him. And now he's kneeling in front of a servant girl, Mira finished quietly, understanding at last the full weight of what had happened in the corridor. Yes, Cain said, which is why I need to understand what is different about you. Not because I suspect you of scheming, though others in this hall certainly do, but because if there is something in you that reaches a creature nothing else has been able to reach, I need to know what it is, and whether it might help him heal from what was done to him. Mira looked down at Fenric again, and this time, instead of fear, she felt something closer to sorrow settle over her chest. She thought of her own childhood, the years of being passed between servant families who fed her because it was expected of them, rather than because they wanted her there, the nights she had gone to sleep hungry and unnoticed. She understood, in a way she had never articulated before, what it meant to be treated as something to manage, rather than someone to care for. I didn't do anything special, she said honestly. I was scared. I thought he might attack me, but when he got close, I looked at him, and I didn't see a monster. I just saw something in pain. I don't know why he responded to that. Maybe he was tired of everyone flinching away from him. Cain was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she could not quite read. Perhaps, he said finally. That is exactly why. He rose from his desk and walked to the door, opening it to reveal Corwin still waiting patiently outside. Effective today, Cain said, Mira Doyle will be assigned to the care of Fenric, under supervision, until we better understand what has occurred and whether it can be sustained. She will report daily. She will not be left alone with him beyond what is necessary for his handling. And she will not discuss the details of this arrangement outside this pack house. Understood, my lord, Corwin said, though his eyes flicked toward Mira with something like surprise, and perhaps a flicker of sympathy for the sudden weight now resting on her narrow shoulders. Mira rose from her chair, unsure whether this new assignment was a gift or a punishment, uncertain whether being noticed by the most powerful man in the territory would improve her life or make it infinitely more complicated. Fenric rose beside her, pressing close against her leg, in a way that felt, for the first time in her life, like she was not entirely alone in facing whatever came next. As she left the study with the great wolf padding silently at her side, she passed Celine Ashby standing near the end of the corridor, arms folded, watching the two of them with an expression carved from cold, careful calculation. Celine said nothing as they passed, but her eyes followed Mira the entire length of the hallway, and Mira felt the weight of that stare, long after she had turned the corner, and it had finally disappeared from view. The kennels where Fenric was normally kept had been built for a creature meant to be contained, rather than cared for. Heavy iron bars lined a stone enclosure at the edge of the training grounds, and thick chains hung from hooks along the wall, unused now but present as a constant reminder of what this place had always been for him. Mira stood at the entrance that morning with a bucket of fresh water and a portion of meat she had been given from the pack kitchens, feeling entirely unprepared for the responsibility that had just been placed on her. Fenric walked past her into the enclosure and sat, watching her with patient silver eyes, as though waiting to see what she would do next. She set the bucket down slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements, and approached with the meat held out in front of her, the way she had seen trainers do with less dangerous animals. He took it gently from her hand, careful, in a way that surprised her, given his size, and the stories she had heard about the damage his jaws could do. She let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, and sat down slowly on an overturned crate near the enclosure wall, watching him eat. "You've had a hard life," she said quietly, more to fill the silence than expecting any response. "I know a little what that's like. Not the same, obviously. Nobody chained me up or trained me through fear, but nobody really looked out for me either. I think maybe that's something we understand about each other, even if we can't say it out loud." Fenric finished eating and moved closer, lowering himself to the ground beside her crate, his massive head resting near her feet the same way it had in the hallway the night before. Mira reached down slowly and let her fingers rest against his fur, and this time neither of them flinched. Word of the arrangement spread through the pack faster than Mira could have imagined, carried on the tongues of servants and warriors alike, twisted and reshaped with each retelling, until she barely recognized her own story by the time it reached her ears secondhand in the kitchens later that day. Some said she had bewitched the beast. Others whispered that she must be some long-lost relative of royalty, hidden away and only now revealing herself. A few, the kinder ones, simply said she had shown the wolf a gentleness no one else had bothered to offer, and that perhaps that alone was enough. Mira did not know which version, if any, was true. She only knew that for the first time in her life, people in the pack were speaking her name, and she was not entirely sure whether that made her safer or placed her in far greater danger than she had ever faced sweeping floors in anonymous silence. A week passed, and the kennels that had once been the most feared place in the entire pack grounds slowly became something closer to a quiet refuge. Mira arrived every morning before the sun had fully risen, carrying food and fresh water, and every morning, Fenric waited for her at the gate of his enclosure, his silver eyes tracking her approach with something that looked, unmistakably now, like anticipation rather than suspicion. She had started talking to him the way she might talk to a friend, filling the silence of her chores with small observations about her day, about the other servants, about the strange new weight of being watched by people who had never once bothered looking at her before. He could not answer her, of course, but he listened in the way animals often do, tilting his head at certain words, resting closer when her voice grew quiet with worry. And Mira found herself looking forward to those mornings, more than she had looked forward to anything in a long time. Not everyone shared her relief at the new arrangement. "You think you're something special now," a servant girl named Ivy said one afternoon, cornering Mira near the well where she had gone to fill her buckets. Ivy had never spoken more than a few clipped words to her in all the years they had worked side by side, but today her voice carried a sharp edge that made it clear she had been saving up resentment for exactly this moment. "Running around after that monster like you're some kind of hero. Everyone's talking about you like you matter now." "I didn't ask for any of this," Mira said quietly, keeping her eyes down the way she always had, though something in her chest had begun to feel less willing to shrink away than it used to. "Doesn't matter what you asked for," Ivy said. "You've got it. The rest of us are still cleaning floors and emptying ash bins, while you get to sit around talking to a wolf and eating from the good kitchens. Must be nice." Mira did not bother explaining that she still slept in a narrow guest room under guard, that she was watched constantly by pack members who did not trust her, that the sudden attention had brought her far more anxiety than comfort. Ivy would not have wanted to hear it, and Mira had learned long ago that some resentments could not be reasoned away, only endured. She finished filling her buckets in silence and carried them back toward the kennels, where Fenric was waiting exactly where she had left him, his ears perking up the moment she came into view. The tightness in her chest eased slightly at the sight of him, and she realized, with something close to surprise, that she felt safer in the company of the most feared creature in the territory than she did among her own kind. That evening, as she settled onto the crate beside his enclosure to share the last of her bread with him, a shadow fell across the ground in front of her. She looked up to find Kane standing at the entrance, his expression unreadable in the fading light, watching the two of them with the same careful scrutiny he had shown her since that first night in the corridor. "You've made progress," he said, stepping closer, though he kept a respectful distance from the enclosure itself, the way he always did now, as though understanding on some level that this space belonged to her and Fenric, in a way it had never belonged to anyone else. "He's easier to be around than most people," Mira said, then immediately worried the comment had been too bold to say aloud to an alpha king. But Kane did not look offended. If anything, something close to amusement flickered across his face for a brief moment, before disappearing again. "He was easier to be around than most people, once," Kane said, settling against the stone wall a few feet from her. "Before everything that was done to him. I remember him as a pup, in the early days after he was brought here. He used to follow the training pups around the yard, playful in a way that seems impossible to imagine now." "What changed?" Mira asked, though she suspected she already knew part of the answer. "Fear changed him," Kane said simply. "The trainers believed a creature that size needed to be controlled through dominance before anything else. They punished mistakes harshly. They rewarded obedience, but never affection. By the time I was old enough to have any authority over his care, the pattern was already set. I tried to soften it where I could, but I inherited a system I did not build, and I was not always wise enough, in those early years, to know how to undo it." Mira glanced at him, surprised by the honesty in his voice, the quiet weight of what sounded almost like guilt. She had expected, from everything she had heard about the Alpha King, someone colder, someone less willing to admit to failures of any kind. "You care about him," she said, before she could stop herself. "More than people realize, I think." Kane's jaw tightened slightly, and for a moment she worried she had overstepped, but he did not deny it. "He has been at my side through more battles than I can count," he said. "He has protected this pack more times than any single warrior in our ranks. Whatever he has become because of the mistakes made before I inherited responsibility for him, he has more than earned whatever peace can still be found for him now." They sat in silence for a while after that, the three of them, as the sun sank fully below the tree line and the training grounds emptied of the last few warriors finishing their evening drills. Mira found herself stealing glances at Kane in the growing dark, noting the way his shoulders relaxed slightly out here, away from the formal weight of the great hall, away from the careful mask he seemed to wear everywhere else in the pack. "Celine doesn't trust me," Mira said eventually, breaking the comfortable quiet, unsure why she felt compelled to voice the worry that had been sitting heavy in her chest since the woman's cold stare in the corridor days earlier. Kane's expression shifted, something guarded settling back over his features. Celine has her own concerns, he said carefully. She has spent years positioning herself as a strong candidate to stand beside me as Luna. Anything unexpected threatens the plans she has built. That is not necessarily a reflection on you specifically. It is simply the nature of pack politics. But she thinks I'm dangerous, Mira pressed gently. Or scheming. I saw it in her face. Kane did not answer immediately, and his silence told her more than any words could have. Be careful around her, he said finally. Not because I believe she would act rashly, but because caution costs nothing, and I would rather you be safe than sorry. The warning settled into Mira's chest like a stone, heavy and cold, and though she nodded and said nothing more, she found herself thinking about it long after Kane had risen to leave. Long after Fenric had curled protectively closer to her side for the night. Long after the kennels had gone quiet and dark around her. She did not know, sitting there beneath the rising moon with her fingers buried in the warm fur of a creature the world called a monster, that Celine Ashby was at that very moment standing in her own private chambers across the pack house, speaking in low, careful tones with a man named Declan Marsh, a beta warrior whose loyalty had long ago been quietly purchased with promises of advancement should Celine ever rise to the position she believed she deserved. The girl is a problem, Celine said, pacing slowly before a cold hearth, her arms folded tightly across her chest. The wolf's behavior around her is already drawing too much attention, and the alpha is spending far more time near those kennels than any reasonable explanation accounts for. What would you have me do? Declan asked, his voice low, careful, the voice of a man who understood exactly how dangerous this conversation was, and had chosen to remain in it anyway. Nothing yet, Celine said, but watch her. Learn everything you can about where she came from, who her people were, what secrets might be hiding beneath that convenient story of an unknown mother and an absent father. Every servant has a history, Declan. I intend to find hers before it becomes inconvenient to discover it too late. Declan nodded once and slipped out of the chamber without another word, leaving Celine alone with the dying embers of the hearth and the quiet, simmering certainty that whatever strange bond had formed between the servant girl and the pack's most feared beast, she would not allow it to threaten everything she had spent years carefully building for herself. Outside, beneath the same moon that watched over the quiet kennels where Mira slept curled against Fenric's warm side, the pack settled into an uneasy rest, unaware that the events set into motion by one unexpected kneeling had already begun to divide loyalties that would soon be tested in ways none of them could yet imagine. The old healer's hut sat at the far edge of the pack grounds, half hidden by overgrown hedges that no one had bothered trimming in years, and Mira had never once had reason to visit it in all her time serving the Ashwood pack. She stood outside its crooked door now, hesitating, a folded scrap of cloth clutched tightly in her hand, wondering if she had made a mistake coming here at all. It had started 3 days earlier, during a routine morning at the kennels, when Fenric had nosed insistently at the small pouch she wore around her neck, the one containing the only item she had ever owned from her mother, a tarnished silver locket too corroded to open, passed down through whichever relative had cared for her in the earliest days before memory. She had always assumed it was worthless, a trinket with no real value beyond sentiment. But Fenric's reaction had been strange, almost urgent, and it had stayed with her long enough that she finally decided to seek out someone who might know more. The healer, an elderly woman named Greta, with silver hair pulled into a severe knot and eyes clouded slightly with age, opened the door before Mira could knock, as though she had been expecting company all morning. "You're the girl the wolf kneels for," Greta said, not a question, studying Mira with an intensity that made her want to shrink back toward the tree line. "Word travels fast in a pack this size. Come in then. Let's see what you've brought me." Mira stepped into the small, cluttered hut, filled with drying herbs hanging from the low ceiling, and shelves crowded with jars of things she could not identify. She held out the locket, and Greta took it carefully, turning it over in gnarled fingers, running her thumb across the tarnished surface, with something like recognition dawning slowly across her weathered face. "Where did you get this?" Greta asked, her voice sharper now, more alert than the pleasant welcome she had offered moments before. "It was my mother's," Mira said. "I don't know much beyond that. She died when I was very young. I was raised by whoever had space and time to look after me. No one ever told me anything about where we came from." Greta was quiet for a long moment, turning the locket over again, holding it up toward the thin light coming through the hut's single window. "This mark," she said finally, tracing a faint engraving along the locket's edge that Mira had never noticed before, worn nearly smooth by age and handling. "Do you know what this is?" Mira shook her head, leaning closer to see what the old woman was pointing at. The engraving was faint, little more than a scratch, but under the light it resolved into a shape she vaguely recognized, a wolf's head, encircled by a ring of small, jagged marks that might once have been runes. "This is an old symbol," Greta said slowly. "Older than this pack, older than most territories currently standing in these lands. It belonged, generations ago, to a bloodline said to carry a particular gift, one that faded from most record and memory, long before I was ever born myself. The old stories called them wolfkin, though not in the way pack members use that phrase today. They were said to hold a connection to wolves themselves that went beyond mating bonds or pack hierarchy, something older, something instinctive, passed down through blood rather than earned through rank." Mira's chest tightened, her mind racing back to the corridor, to the moment Fenric had knelt before her without explanation, to every quiet interaction since that, had felt less like taming a beast and more like recognizing an old friend. "You think that's what this is," Mira said quietly. "You think that's why he responds to me the way he does." "I think," Greta said carefully, setting the locket back into Mira's palm, "that it would explain a great deal that otherwise makes no sense at all. But bloodlines like this were nearly wiped out generations ago, hunted and scattered during territory wars when other packs feared the kind of influence such a connection might grant to whoever possessed it. If you truly carry that blood, girl, you would be wise to keep this knowledge close and share it carefully, if at all." "Why?" Mira asked, though some part of her already understood the answer before Greta spoke it aloud. "Because power, even inherited and unchosen, makes people afraid," Greta said, "and fear makes people dangerous, especially those who believe they have something to lose because of it." Mira left the healer's hut with far more questions than answers, the locket clutched tightly in her fist, her mind spinning with possibilities she had never once considered in all her years of quiet, unremarkable servitude. She had always believed herself to be nobody, a girl with no history worth telling, and now, suddenly, she carried the weight of a bloodline old enough to be spoken of only in fading legend. She did not notice, as she made her way back toward the kennels lost in thought, that Declan Marsh had been watching from a distance the entire time, tucked behind the cover of the overgrown hedges, close enough to see her enter the healer's hut, and close enough to note, with growing interest, the careful way she now held whatever small object she had carried out with her. He waited until she was well out of sight before making his own way toward Greta's hut, a coin purse already loosening at his belt, prepared to offer whatever price necessary to learn exactly what had passed between the servant girl and the old healer behind that crooked wooden door. Greta, however, had lived long enough in this pack to recognize the particular shape of Declan's ambition the moment he stepped through her doorway, and she offered him nothing beyond vague pleasantries about herbs and remedies, watching him leave with the same clouded, knowing eyes she had turned on Mira only an hour before. Whatever secrets passed through her hut, she had long ago decided, would be shared on her own terms, and Declan Marsh's coin purse would buy him nothing today. That evening, back at the kennels, Mira sat beside Fenric as the sun set behind the tree line, turning the tarnished locket over in her fingers, studying the faint wolf's head symbol now that she knew what to look for. Fenric watched her closely, his silver eyes tracking the small object with the same unusual intensity he had shown days before. "Do you know what I am?" she asked him quietly, only half expecting an answer, though somehow the question felt important to voice aloud regardless. "Because I don't think I do, not really. Not anymore." Fenric shifted closer, resting his massive head against her knee, and Mira found herself smiling despite the uncertainty churning inside her, grateful, at least, that whatever strange inheritance she carried in her blood had brought her this one steady, quiet companion who asked nothing of her beyond her presence. Footsteps approached from the direction of the pack house, and Mira looked up to find Kane walking toward the kennels, his expression thoughtful, almost hesitant in a way she had not seen from him before. "You went to see the healer today," he said, settling against the enclosure wall in his now familiar spot. Word truly did travel fast within these walls, Mira thought, though she supposed she should not be surprised. "I did," she admitted, deciding there was little point in denying it. "Fenric reacted strangely to something I carry, an old locket from my mother. I wanted to understand why." "And did you find your answer?" Kane asked, his eyes flicking briefly toward the object still resting in her open palm. Mira hesitated, remembering Greta's warning about the dangers of such knowledge falling into the wrong hands, uncertain whether the Alpha King himself counted among those she should be cautious around, despite the growing warmth she had begun to feel in his presence these past several days. "I found more questions than answers," she said carefully, which was not entirely a lie. "But I think there may be something in my family's past that explains why Fenric trusts me the way he does. Something old, something most people have forgotten." Kane studied her for a long moment, and Mira braced herself for suspicion, for the same cold calculation she had seen reflected so often in Celine's eyes. Instead, something in his expression softened, almost imperceptibly, into something closer to understanding. "Whatever you are," he said quietly, "wherever you come from, it has not changed what I have watched happen between you and this wolf over these past days. Blood and bloodlines matter a great deal in this world, more than I sometimes wish they did. But I have learned, over years of ruling this pack, that character matters more, in the end, than inheritance ever could." Mira did not know how to respond to that, her chest tightening with an emotion she could not quite name, something warm and unfamiliar blooming beneath the uncertainty that had followed her since leaving Greta's hut that afternoon. She only nodded, grateful, and turned her attention back to Fenric as the last light faded from the sky above Ashwood territory, unaware that the quiet moment shared between the three of them was already being reported, in careful, calculated detail, to a woman who had no intention of allowing any of it to continue unchallenged. The accusation came on a gray morning, delivered loudly enough in the pack kitchens that every servant within earshot stopped their work to listen. A silver hairpin, expensive, and clearly not the property of any kitchen worker, had gone missing from Celine Ashby's private chambers, and by midday, word had already spread that it had been found tucked inside a folded cloth in the small guest room where Mira Doyle had been staying under guard. Mira heard about it secondhand, from a wide-eyed kitchen girl who nearly dropped a tray of bread in her hurry to deliver the news, and her stomach dropped so fast and so hard that for a moment she thought she might be sick right there in the corridor. "That's not possible," she said, though the words felt weak even as she spoke them. "I've never even been inside her chambers. I wouldn't know where to find her hairpins if I tried." "Doesn't matter what's possible," the kitchen girl said, not unkindly, though her eyes carried the particular gleam of someone relieved not to be the one in trouble. "They found it in your room. Guards are already looking for you." Mira did not wait to hear more. She turned and half ran toward the kennels, some instinct pulling her toward Fenric before she even fully understood why, as though his presence alone might steady the ground that suddenly felt like it was shifting beneath her feet. She found him waiting at the enclosure gate, ears already pricked forward, alert to her distress before she had said a single word. "Someone's trying to frame me," she said, breathless, pressing her forehead briefly against the cool iron bars separating them. "I don't know why, I don't know how, but they found something in my room that isn't mine, and now everyone thinks I'm a thief." Fenric let out a low, unsettled sound, pacing along the length of the enclosure with agitation Mira had not seen from him since that first terrifying night in the corridor. She barely had time to process his reaction before the sound of approaching boots on gravel made her turn, heart pounding, to find two guards flanking Declan Marsh as they crossed the training grounds toward her. "Mira Doyle," Declan said, his voice carrying the false gravity of a man enjoying a task he had clearly been eager to perform. "You're to come with us. There are questions regarding a missing item found among your belongings." "I didn't take anything," Mira said, forcing steadiness into her voice despite the fear clawing at her chest. "I've never even set foot near the Lady Celine's chambers." "That will be for the Alpha to determine," Declan said, gesturing for the guards to step forward. The moment one of them reached toward Mira's arm, Fenric's agitation exploded into something far more dangerous. He threw himself against the enclosure gate with a force that rattled the iron bars and sent both guards stumbling backward, a deep, warning growl rolling from his chest that silenced every other sound on the training grounds. Declan went pale, taking an involuntary step back despite himself, his earlier confidence draining rapidly from his face. "Control that beast," he snapped, though his voice cracked slightly on the command. "He's not attacking anyone," Mira said quickly, raising her hands, desperate to prevent the situation from spiraling further out of control. "He's frightened for me, that's all. Please, just let me explain to the Alpha myself. I have nothing to hide." It was Kane's voice that finally cut through the tension, sharp and commanding, as he strode across the grounds with Corwin close behind him, clearly having been alerted the moment the confrontation began drawing attention. "Enough," he said, and the entire scene seemed to still around him. "What is happening here?" "My lord," Declan said, straightening quickly. "A missing item belonging to Lady Selene was discovered in the servants' guest room. We were simply escorting her for questioning when the beast became aggressive." Kane's eyes moved from Declan to Mira to Fenric, still pacing anxiously along the enclosure fence, and finally settled on the gate itself, taking in the full picture with the same careful, measured calm he brought to every difficult decision. "Release the gate," he said quietly, and though the guards hesitated, none of them dared disobey a direct order from their alpha. The moment the gate opened, Fenric moved immediately to Mira's side, pressing close against her, his low growl finally quieting into watchful silence now that Kane himself stood near enough to reassure him that the immediate danger had passed. Mira let out a shaky breath, grateful beyond words for the wolf's steady presence beside her. "Tell me exactly what was found and where," Kane said, turning his attention fully to Declan. "A silver hairpin, my lord, found wrapped in cloth beneath the bedding in the guest room assigned to the girl." "And who discovered it?" Declan hesitated for just a fraction of a second too long. "Lady Selene's own attendant, my lord, during a routine search after the item was reported missing." "A routine search," Kane repeated, something cold entering his voice now. "Conducted in a servant's private guest room, without my knowledge or approval, resulting in a conveniently placed item that happens to implicate the one person in this pack who has drawn Lady Selene's suspicion since the moment my Warwolf knelt before her." Silence stretched across the training grounds, broken only by the distant clang of a training weapon somewhere beyond the yard. Declan's face had gone carefully blank, the way a man's face goes blank when he realizes he has said more than he intended and cannot take it back. "I want the room searched again, in my presence," Kane said finally, "along with a full account of who had access to that room over the past several days. And I want Lady Selene informed that I will be speaking with her directly regarding this matter." "Yes, my lord," Declan said, bowing quickly before retreating with the guards, clearly relieved to escape the weight of Kane's attention. Once they had gone, Kane turned to Mira, his expression softening slightly, though the tension in his jaw remained. "I don't believe you took anything," he said simply. "I want you to know that, regardless of what is found or claimed in the coming hours." "Thank you," Mira said quietly, her voice still unsteady from the fear that had gripped her only minutes before. "I truly don't understand why someone would go through this much trouble over me." "I'm nobody, my lord. I clean kennels." "You are no longer simply someone who cleans kennels," Kane said, something gentler entering his voice. "Whether you asked for that change or not, it has already happened, and it seems not everyone in this pack is prepared to accept it gracefully." He walked with her back toward the enclosure, Fenric trailing close on her other side, and for a moment, despite everything that had just happened, Mira felt something like safety settle over her, flanked as she was by a king willing to defend her, and a beast willing to fight for her, both of them choosing, in their own ways, to stand against whatever storm was clearly building around her. That evening, in the privacy of her own chambers, Selene Ashby received Kane's summons with outward calm, though inwardly, she seethed at how quickly her carefully arranged plan had unraveled. She had expected Declan to handle the matter with more discretion, expected the guards to move swiftly enough that questions would come only after the girl had already been discredited, and removed from the kennels entirely. Instead, Kane had seen through the scheme within hours, and now she would be forced to face him with nothing but careful denials and practiced innocence to shield herself from his growing suspicion. "You wish to speak with me," she said smoothly, when Kane arrived at her chambers, his expression carefully neutral in the way that told her, more than any harsh words could have, exactly how much trouble she was in. "I did," Kane said, closing the door behind him. "Tell me about the hairpin, Celine. And choose your words carefully, because I have very little patience remaining for convenient explanations tonight." Celine met his gaze steadily, already rearranging the pieces of her story in her mind, searching for the version that might yet salvage what remained of her position, while beneath her calm exterior, a colder, sharper resolve began to take shape. If subtlety would no longer serve her purposes where the servant girl was concerned, then perhaps it was time to consider methods considerably less subtle instead. The horn sounded twice before dawn, a deep, urgent call that Mira had never heard before, but that every pack member around her seemed to recognize instantly, dropping whatever they were doing and racing toward the training grounds with weapons already in hand. She sat up in her narrow bed, heart pounding, and found Fenric already on his feet at the door, hackles raised, a low growl building steadily in his chest. "What's happening?" she whispered, though there was no one nearby to answer her. She dressed quickly and hurried out into the corridor, following the rush of pack members toward the source of the commotion, Fenric pressing close against her side the entire way. Outside, the training grounds had transformed into a scene of controlled chaos, warriors forming defensive lines near the northern border fence, while Kane stood at the center of it all, already dressed for battle, issuing orders in a voice that carried clear and steady, despite the tension crackling through the air. "Rogue pack," Corwin said grimly, appearing at her side as though he had been sent specifically to explain the situation to her. "Border scouts spotted them moving in from the northern ridge nearly an hour ago. Looks like they've been testing our defenses for weeks, probing for weaknesses. Tonight they decided to act on what they found." "How many?" Mira asked, fear tightening in her throat as she watched warriors rushing past in every direction. "Enough to be a real threat," Corwin admitted, "though not enough, I hope, to overwhelm what we've built here, if everyone holds their positions." Kane's eyes found Mira across the chaos of the yard, and for a brief moment, something like worry flickered across his face before he schooled it back into the calm, commanding expression his pack needed to see from him now. "Get her to the shelter beneath the pack house," he called to Corwin. "Now." But before Corwin could act on the order, the first wave of rogue wolves broke through the northern tree line, and the training grounds erupted into full battle, warriors clashing against attackers in the pale pre-dawn light, the sound of snarling and shouted commands filling the air on every side. Mira froze, caught in the open between fighting bodies, and felt Fenric's presence solidify at her side, no longer simply protective, but fully alert, muscles coiled and ready. A rogue wolf broke free from the main skirmish, charging directly toward her with speed that left no time for her to run. She barely had time to register the danger before Fenric moved, intercepting the attacker with a force that sent both creatures tumbling across the churned earth of the training yard. Mira stumbled backward, pressing herself against the stone wall of a nearby building, watching in terrified fascination as Fenric fought with a controlled, ferocious precision that made it clear, for the first time since she had met him, exactly why the pack had once feared him so deeply. He was not simply defending himself. He was defending her, driving the attacker back with relentless focus, refusing to let it get anywhere near where she stood frozen against the wall. "Get inside," Kane's voice cut through the chaos as he appeared beside her, breathing hard, blood on his knuckles from an earlier clash. "Now, Mira, please. I can't just leave him out here," she said, watching Fenric finally drive the rogue wolf back toward the tree line, where the rest of the invading force was already beginning to retreat under the pack's coordinated defense. "He'll be fine," Kane said firmly, though his eyes carried genuine worry as he glanced toward the fighting. "But I need to know you're safe, or I cannot focus on what's happening here." The admission, raw and unguarded in the middle of battle, struck Mira harder than she expected. She nodded finally, allowing him to guide her toward the shelter entrance, though she paused at the doorway to look back one last time, watching Fenric and a handful of warriors finish driving the last of the rogue attackers back across the border fence into the darkness beyond. The battle did not last much longer after that. Within the hour, the horn sounded a different pattern, 3 short blasts signaling the threat had passed, and pack members began the slow work of tending wounds and counting losses in the gray light of early morning. Mira emerged from the shelter the moment it was declared safe, searching immediately for Fenric among the exhausted warriors gathering near the center of the yard. She found him near the northern fence, favoring one front leg slightly, a shallow gash along his shoulder that had already begun to clot, but clearly still pained him. She rushed to his side without hesitation, kneeling in the churned earth to examine the wound, despite his low, uncomfortable growl of protest. "Let me see," she said firmly, and to her surprise, he stilled beneath her hands, allowing her to inspect the injury with a trust that made something warm bloom beneath the fear still coursing through her chest. "You saved my life," she said quietly, pressing her forehead briefly against his uninjured side. "Thank you." "He would have done the same for anyone he considered pack," Kane said, approaching from behind, his own injuries mostly minor, a shallow cut along his jaw the worst of what she could see. "But I don't think I've ever seen him fight with quite that level of focus before." "Is everyone all right?" Mira asked, rising to her feet, taking in the scattered wounded being tended to across the yard. "We were fortunate," Kane said, his jaw tightening slightly. "A few serious injuries, nothing beyond what our healers can manage. It could have been far worse, had they caught us less prepared." "Why did they attack now?" Mira asked. "After everything that's happened this past week, it feels like more than coincidence." Kane's expression darkened, something calculating entering his gaze as he studied the retreating tree line beyond the fence. "I don't believe it was coincidence at all," he said slowly. "Rogue packs do not typically test a territory's defenses for weeks before striking without reason. Someone may have provided them information about weaknesses in our patrol patterns, timing that would explain why they chose tonight specifically, when attention within the pack has been divided by other matters." The implication settled heavily between them, and Mira felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. "You think someone inside the pack helped them?" she said quietly. "I think," Kane said carefully, "that I have learned, over the years, not to dismiss uncomfortable possibilities simply because they are uncomfortable. And I think it would be wise for both of us to be more careful than we have been, until I understand exactly what is happening within these walls." He looked at her then, something unguarded in his expression that she had not seen from him before, stripped of the careful authority he wore in front of the rest of the pack. "I am glad you are safe," he said simply, and the words carried a weight that went beyond simple relief, something that made Mira's chest tighten with an emotion she did not yet have a name for. "I'm glad you are too," she said quietly, and for a moment, standing together in the wreckage of a battle that had nearly cost them both far more than either wanted to consider, the distance between an alpha king and a servant girl felt smaller than it ever had before. Fenric shifted beside them, nudging gently against Mira's hand, as though reminding them both that he, too, had a stake in whatever was growing between the three of them, forged now not only through an unexplained kneeling in a dim corridor, but through blood and battle and the fierce, unwavering instinct to protect what mattered most. Behind them, unseen in the chaos of the retreating dawn, Declan Marsh watched the scene from the shadow of the northern wall, his own thoughts turning carefully over the failed attack, the growing bond he had just witnessed, and the message he would need to deliver, discreetly and soon, to the woman who had promised him considerably more than his current rank if he continued proving useful to her ambitions. 3 days after the attack, Kane summoned the pack elders to the Great Hall for a formal council, and for the first time since her arrival in that room, weeks earlier, Mira was invited to attend rather than simply questioned and dismissed. She stood near the edge of the gathering, Fenric settled calmly at her feet, watching as Kane laid out everything the investigation had uncovered since the rogue attack, including troubling evidence that patrol schedules had somehow reached hands outside the pack in the days leading up to the assault. "We have not yet confirmed who is responsible," Kane said, his voice carrying easily across the hushed hall. "But I intend to find out, and when I do, there will be consequences severe enough to ensure nothing like this happens again." Mira noticed Celine standing near the front of the gathering, her expression carefully composed, betraying nothing beyond polite concern for the pack's security. Beside her, Declan Marsh shifted his weight slightly, and though his face remained mostly still, Mira caught the faint tightening around his eyes, the same look she imagined a man might wear when standing far too close to a fire he had helped set himself. After the council concluded, Greta the healer approached Mira quietly near the hall's entrance, her weathered face set with unusual seriousness. "Walk with me," she said simply, and Mira followed, Fenric trailing close behind, out into the cool afternoon air beyond the packhouse. "I have spent the past several days searching through old records," Greta said, once they were alone, away from listening ears. "After you came to me with that locket, I could not stop thinking about the symbol engraved upon it, and I wanted to be certain of what I told you before speaking further." "And what did you find?" Mira asked, her chest tightening with anticipation. "Confirmation," Greta said, "of a story I had only ever heard as legend before now. Generations ago, long before Ashwood Pack existed in its current form, there lived a bloodline known as the Kindred, humans who carried, through some quirk of fate or old magic no one fully understood, a connection to wolves that ran deeper than any bond formed through mating or pack hierarchy. Wolves recognized them instinctively, responded to them with a trust and loyalty that could not be trained or earned through ordinary means. It was said that even the most damaged, most dangerous wolves would calm in their presence, recognizing something in their blood that spoke directly to the wildness in themselves. "What happened to them?" Mira asked quietly, though something in Greta's expression already told her the answer would not be a happy one. "Fear," Greta said simply, as is so often the case with gifts that cannot be controlled or replicated by ordinary means. Other packs saw the influence the Kindred held over wolves, even wolves not their own, and worried what such power might mean if turned toward conquest rather than kindness. Territory wars scattered them across these lands generations ago, and most bloodlines were hunted nearly to extinction, their descendants forced to hide their heritage or lose it entirely through generations of secrecy. Mira absorbed this in silence, her hand drifting unconsciously toward Fenric's head, resting there as though the contact might steady the strange, unmoored feeling settling over her. "You think I'm one of them?" she said finally, "a descendant." "I think it would explain everything we have witnessed since the night that Wolf first knelt before you," Greta said. "The locket you carry bears the mark of the Kindred bloodline, exactly as the old records describe it. Your instinctive calm around a creature every trained handler in this pack has feared for years. The way he fought to protect you during the attack, with a ferocity beyond even his usual battle discipline. These are not coincidences, child. I believe, as much as I can believe anything from stories passed down through generations, that you carry that old blood in your veins." "What does that mean for me now?" Mira asked, fear, and something close to wonder, tangled together in her voice. "I do not know," Greta admitted honestly. "The Kindred have not been seen openly in this territory for longer than anyone living can remember. Some in this pack may view your heritage as something worth celebrating, a rare and valuable gift returned to these lands after generations of absence. Others," she paused, her expression turning grave, "may see it exactly as those old enemies once did, as a threat to be eliminated, before it can grow into something they cannot control." The warning settled into Mira's chest with familiar weight, echoing everything Greta had told her weeks before, everything Cain himself had cautioned her to remain careful about since the moment his suspicion had first turned toward Celine. She thought of the hairpin planted in her room, the convenient timing of the rogue attack, the cold calculation she had seen reflected so often in Celine's eyes since that very first night in the corridor. "Does the Alpha need to know what you've told me?" Mira asked. "That is your choice to make," Greta said gently. "Though I suspect, given everything already unfolding within this pack, he may need to know sooner rather than later, if only to understand fully what forces might be working against you both." Mira returned to the kennels that evening with her mind heavy with everything Greta had revealed, Fenric pressing close against her side the entire walk back, as though sensing the weight settling over her. She found Cain waiting near the enclosure when she arrived, his expression thoughtful, and something in his posture told her he had been waiting specifically for her return. "Greta came to see me earlier," he said, before she could speak. She told me some of what she shared with you, though she left the fuller explanation for you to give yourself, if you chose to. Mira hesitated only a moment, before deciding that whatever risk came with sharing this truth, she trusted Cain enough by now to place it in his hands. She told him everything: the locket, the old symbol, the story of the kindred bloodline scattered generations ago by fear and territorial war, watching his expression shift through surprise into something more thoughtful and considering as she spoke. "I have heard fragments of that legend before," he admitted when she finished. "Though I confess, I always assumed it belonged more to old campfire tales than actual history. If Greta believes the connection is genuine, I am inclined to trust her judgment. She has served this pack faithfully for longer than I have been alive, and she is not a woman prone to exaggeration." "What happens now?" Mira asked, echoing the same question she had posed to Greta only hours before. Cain was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression that carried none of the suspicion he had shown that first night, replaced instead by something warmer, something that made her breath catch slightly in her chest. "Now," he said finally, "I suppose we continue exactly as we have been, careful, watchful, and unwilling to let fear, whether Celine's or anyone else's, dictate what this pack chooses to value." He reached out, hesitating only briefly before resting his hand lightly against Fenric's head, and the wolf, for the first time since Mira had known him, allowed the touch without tension, without flinching away, as though something in the quiet honesty of the moment had eased whatever old wound still lingered beneath his scarred exterior. "Thank you for trusting me with this," Cain said quietly, looking up to meet Mira's eyes. "Thank you for being someone worth trusting," she answered, and meant it more fully than she had meant almost anything else she had said since arriving in this pack all those years ago, as a nameless, overlooked servant girl. Neither of them noticed, in the quiet warmth of that shared moment, the faint rustle of movement near the far wall of the training grounds, where Declan Marsh crouched low in the gathering shadows, close enough to have overheard every word, already calculating how quickly he could deliver this new and dangerous piece of information to the woman waiting anxiously for his report. Celine's chambers were dark, except for a single candle burning low on the table between her and Declan, the flickering light casting long shadows across her face as she listened to his report with growing alarm. The word kindred hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither of them fully understood, but both recognized as dangerous enough to change everything. "An old bloodline with power over wolves," Celine repeated slowly, pacing before the cold hearth, the way she always did when calculating her next move. "And the Alpha already believes it, already trusts her with it." "That's what I heard, my lady," Declan said. "They spoke of it openly, near the kennels. The healer confirmed it through old records. If it's true, and the pack learns of it fully, her position here will be unshakable. No one will question the wolf's loyalty to her, or the Alpha's growing regard for her, ever again." Celine's hands curled into fists at her sides. Years of careful positioning, years of cultivating alliances among the pack elders, years of ensuring her own bloodline and reputation remained spotless enough to secure her place beside Cain Voss when the time came for him to choose a Luna, all of it now threatened by a servant girl who had done nothing more than exist in the wrong hallway at the wrong moment. "We cannot allow this to continue building," she said finally, her voice cold and decisive in a way that made Declan shift uneasily in his seat. "Subtlety has already failed us once. The hairpin should have removed her from consideration entirely, and instead, it only deepened the Alpha's suspicion of anyone standing against her." "What would you have me do?" Declan asked carefully, though something in his tone suggested he already suspected the answer would ask more of him than he was entirely comfortable providing. "The girl needs to disappear," Celine said simply. "Not harmed beyond necessity. I am not a monster, whatever you may think of my methods. But removed from this pack entirely, somewhere far enough away that even that beast cannot track her scent back to us, and with enough evidence left behind to suggest she chose to leave of her own accord, frightened perhaps by the sudden weight of attention placed upon her." "And if the wolf notices her missing before we can establish that story?" Declan asked. "He has proven, more than once now, that he will not simply accept her absence quietly. Then we will need to ensure he is occupied elsewhere when it happens," Celine said, already turning the details over in her mind, with the same cold precision she applied to every difficult problem she had faced in her years of careful ambition. There is a training exercise planned for the border patrols in 3 days, one that will require the Alpha's beast to accompany the warriors assigned to it. That will give us the window we need. Declan hesitated, clearly wrestling with the weight of what he was being asked to participate in, but years of promised advancement and quiet loyalty won out over whatever reservations lingered in his conscience. "I'll make the arrangements," he said finally, rising from his seat. "See that you do," Celine said, and Declan, "make certain nothing about this can be traced back to either of us. I have not spent this many years building my position in this pack, only to lose it now, over a servant girl who happened to catch the eye of a wolf." 3 days later, the morning of the scheduled border training exercise, Mira woke to an unusually quiet kennel, Fenric already gone, summoned before dawn by Corwin himself with orders that seemed, on the surface, entirely routine. She spent the morning attending to her usual chores, feeding the remaining pack animals, cleaning the enclosures, trying to ignore the faint unease settling in her chest at the unfamiliar quiet of the grounds, without Fenric's steady presence beside her. A young servant boy approached her near midday, breathless and nervous, claiming Cain had requested her presence at the edge of the eastern woods, near a quiet clearing where he sometimes went to think alone, away from the pressures of the pack house. Mira hesitated only briefly before agreeing, and some part of her instinctively pleased at the thought of a quiet moment alone with him, unaware that the message had never come from Cain at all, but from Declan, carefully disguised through a messenger, too young and too eager to please, to question the instructions given to him. She walked the familiar path toward the eastern woods alone, the afternoon sun filtering warm through the canopy above, and did not notice, until it was already far too late, the figures waiting silently in the shadows just beyond the clearing's edge. A hand clamped firmly over her mouth before she could scream, and strong arms pulled her backward off the path, into the deeper cover of the trees, where struggling did little good against the greater strength holding her fast. She caught only a brief glimpse of her attacker's face, a warrior she did not recognize, before a cloth soaked in something sharp and bitter was pressed against her nose and mouth, and the world around her began to blur and darken at the edges. Her last coherent thought, as consciousness slipped away entirely, was of Fenric, somewhere far beyond the border patrol lines, and the desperate, wordless hope that he would somehow know, would somehow sense that something had gone terribly wrong, in time to matter. When Mira did not return to the kennels by evening, it was Cain himself who first noticed her absence, arriving to check on her as he had grown accustomed to doing each night since the attack, only to find the enclosure empty and cold, no sign of her anywhere among the usual places she might have wandered. His unease sharpened into alarm when the young servant boy, questioned carefully by Corwin, finally admitted, tearfully, that he had delivered a message he now realized had never truly come from the Alpha at all, describing instead a stranger who had approached him near the kitchens, with coin and careful instructions. By the time Fenric and the Border Patrol returned from their exercise near dusk, the wolf immediately sensing something wrong the moment he crossed back into the main grounds, Cain had already organized search parties combing every inch of the pack's territory, his composure fraying at the edges, in a way none of his warriors had ever witnessed from their Alpha before. Fenric caught Mira's scent near the eastern clearing within minutes of being released to search, his agitation building into something close to frenzy as he followed the trail deeper into the woods, past the point where it grew faint and scattered, mixed with the unmistakable scent of a struggle and something bitter and chemical that made his hackles rise with instinctive alarm. "She's been taken," Cain said grimly, kneeling beside the disturbed earth at the trail's end, his hands clenched into fists as the full weight of the realization settled over him. Someone planned this carefully enough to lure her away and cover their tracks. Corwin's expression darkened as understanding dawned. "The training exercise," he said slowly. "Fenric being called away this morning, right before she disappeared. That timing wasn't a coincidence, my lord." Cain rose slowly, his expression hardening into something cold and dangerous that few in the pack had ever witnessed from him, the careful composure of an Alpha King giving way, for just a moment, to the raw fury of a man realizing someone had taken something precious from him through calculated cruelty. "Find Celine Ashby," he said, his voice low and controlled in a way that carried far more menace than shouting ever could have. "And find Declan Marsh. I want them both brought to me tonight, and I want every warrior in this pack ready to search until Mira is found, whatever that requires, whatever it costs." Beside him, Fenric let out a sound unlike anything the pack had heard from him before, a mournful, furious howl that echoed across the darkening territory, carrying with it every ounce of desperate loyalty the beast had come to feel for the one person in his damaged, difficult life who had ever simply chosen to see him without fear. Mira woke to the smell of damp stone and the dull ache of rope biting into her wrists, tied firmly behind her back against the trunk of what felt like an old support beam. Her head throbbed from whatever had been used to knock her unconscious, and it took several long, disorienting minutes before her eyes adjusted enough to make sense of her surroundings. She was in some kind of abandoned cellar, judging by the crumbling stone walls and the single shaft of moonlight filtering through a narrow gap near the ceiling. A lantern burned low on a wooden crate nearby, casting flickering shadows across the small space, and beside it sat a warrior she did not recognize, arms crossed, watching her with the bored patience of a man performing a task he had been well paid to complete. "You're awake," he said flatly, not moving from his position. "Good. Lady Celine wanted to speak with you before we move you further from the territory." "Celine did this," Mira said, her voice hoarse, though somehow the confirmation did not surprise her as much as it should have. "Why? What could I possibly have done to deserve this?" "Above my concern," the warrior said. "I do what I'm paid to do, and ask no questions I don't need answered." Footsteps echoed on stone stairs somewhere beyond the cellar door, and a moment later, Celine herself entered, dressed plainly, none of the fine fabrics she usually favored, clearly having taken precautions to avoid drawing attention on her way to this remote location. She studied Mira with an expression that held less triumph than Mira had expected, and something closer to weary resignation. "I did not want it to come to this," Celine said, kneeling slightly to meet Mira's eyes directly. "Truly, I did not. But you must understand, girl, what you represent threatens everything I have spent years building for myself in that pack, an unclaimed bloodline with power over wolves, drawing the alpha's attention and affection so quickly and so completely. I could not simply stand by and watch my position dissolve because a servant girl happened to catch a wolf's attention in a hallway." "So you would have me disappear entirely," Mira said, anger cutting through the fear now, giving her voice a steadiness she had not expected to find. "Taken from everything I know, simply because I frighten you." "You misunderstand," Celine said, straightening again. "I have no intention of harming you. You will simply be relocated, far from this territory, given enough coin to establish a new life, somewhere your presence poses no threat to anyone. In time, the pack will forget you, the wolf's strange behavior will fade into old story, and life here will continue as it was always meant to. And if I refuse to simply disappear quietly," Mira said. Something colder flickered across Celine's expression. "You will not have that choice," she said simply, before turning and climbing back up the stone stairs, leaving the warrior alone once more to guard his silent, furious prisoner. Mira strained against the ropes binding her wrists, testing their strength with quiet, careful movements, refusing to let the fear building in her chest overtake the determination settling alongside it. She thought of Fenric, of the last morning she had seen him before he was called away for the border exercise, and hoped desperately that the bond between them ran deep enough to guide him to her, wherever this forgotten cellar happened to be hidden. She did not have to wait long to find out. The first sound was distant, a low howl carried faintly on the night air, followed moments later by shouting somewhere far above the cellar, muffled voices rising in alarm. The warrior guarding her straightened immediately, hand moving to the weapon at his belt, tension radiating from his stance as the commotion grew steadily closer. The cellar door burst open with a force that sent splinters flying across the stone floor, and Fenric surged through the opening like a living storm, silver eyes blazing in the lantern light, a deep, furious snarl rolling from his chest the moment his gaze landed on Mira, bound helplessly against the support beam. The warrior barely had time to draw his weapon before Fenric closed the distance between them, driving him backward against the far wall with enough force to knock the breath entirely from his lungs, pinning him there with a controlled ferocity that made it perfectly clear how easily this could end, far worse for him than a simple bruising. "Fenric," Mira gasped, relief flooding through her so completely that tears sprang unbidden to her eyes. "You found me." The wolf's growl softened the moment her voice reached him, though he kept the warrior pinned firmly against the wall, as Cain appeared in the doorway behind him, Corwin, and a handful of warriors close on his heels, weapons drawn and ready. "Mira?" Cain breathed, relief and fury warring visibly across his face, as he crossed the cellar in 3 quick strides, kneeling to work at the ropes binding her wrists with hands that trembled slightly despite his best efforts to remain composed. "Are you hurt? Tell me the truth." "Just a headache," she said, her voice shaking now that the danger had finally passed, the adrenaline that had kept her steady beginning to drain away and leave something closer to overwhelming relief in its place. "Celine, she was here. She said she was going to have me taken far from the territory, that she couldn't allow me to threaten her position." "I know," Cain said grimly, finally freeing her wrists and helping her to her feet, one arm wrapping steady and protective around her shoulders the moment she swayed with dizziness. "Declan confessed everything the moment we brought him in for questioning. He gave up the location of this place readily enough, once he understood the alternative." Corwin and the other warriors moved to secure the guard still pinned beneath Fenric's watchful glare, binding his hands with the same rope that had held Mira only moments before, while Cain guided her carefully toward the cellar stairs, Fenric falling into step close at her other side the moment he was satisfied the immediate threat had been neutralized. "Where is Celine now?" Mira asked, as they emerged into the cool night air above, the forest around them alive with the sounds of warriors, still combing the area for any further threat. Cain's expression hardened into something dangerous and resolute. "Being located as we speak," he said. "She will answer for this before the full pack council, and I promise you, whatever punishment fits the severity of what she has done, she will not escape it through careful words or old alliances." Mira leaned into his side as they walked, exhaustion finally catching up with her now that the danger had truly passed, and Fenric pressed close against her other side, his warm, steady presence grounding her through the last of the lingering fear still coursing through her veins. "Thank you," she whispered, glancing between the man and the wolf who had both, in their own fierce, unwavering ways, refused to stop searching until they found her. "Both of you. I don't know how to properly thank either of you for this." "You do not need to thank us," Cain said quietly, his arm tightening slightly around her shoulders as they made their way back toward the safety of Ashwood territory, beneath the pale light of the moon. "You only need to trust that whatever comes next, you will not face it alone again. Not while either of us has breath left to stand beside you." Behind them, deep in the forest, search parties finally closed in on Celine Ashby's hurried, desperate flight toward the northern border, her carefully constructed plans collapsing entirely around her with every passing minute, while ahead, at the edge of the tree line, the lights of the pack house glowed warm and welcoming, promising, at long last, a return to safety for the girl who had never once asked for any of the danger that had found her, but who had faced every bit of it with a quiet courage that had already changed, forever, the way an entire pack would come to see her. The great hall was fuller than Mira had ever seen it. Every senior member of Ashwood Pack gathered beneath the high stone ceiling, torchlight flickering across faces that had once looked at her with suspicion and now watched with something closer to careful curiosity, waiting to see how the final chapter of the past several weeks would come to a close. Celine Ashby stood before the high seat, hands bound loosely in front of her, stripped of the fine confidence that had always marked her presence in this hall before. She had been found near the northern border only hours after Mira's rescue, and though her expression remained composed, there was no mistaking the tightness around her eyes, the quiet understanding that whatever came next would mark the end of everything she had spent years carefully building. "Celine Ashby," Cain said, his voice carrying clear and steady across the silent hall. "You stand accused of orchestrating the abduction of a member of this pack, of conspiring to weaken our border defenses for personal gain, and of betraying the trust placed in you as a senior figure within these walls. Declan Marsh has confirmed your involvement in full detail. What do you have to say in your defense?" Celine lifted her chin slightly, though the fight had clearly gone out of her posture. "I acted out of fear," she said finally, her voice quieter than Mira had ever heard it. "Fear of losing everything I had worked toward. Fear of being replaced by someone who did nothing to earn the position she found herself in. That does not excuse what I did. I understand that. But it is the truth of it, whatever good that truth does me now." Cain studied her for a long moment, and Mira, standing near the front of the gathered crowd with Fenric steady at her side, saw something almost like sympathy cross his expression before it hardened back into the resolve required of an alpha delivering judgment. "Fear does not excuse cruelty," he said finally. "You will be stripped of your position and standing within this pack, and you will be exiled from Ashwood territory, effective immediately. You will not return, under any circumstance, without facing far graver consequences than exile alone." A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd, though none dared voice open objection to the alpha's judgment. Celine's shoulders sagged slightly, but she said nothing more, allowing the guards to lead her from the hall toward whatever uncertain future awaited her beyond the borders she had once hoped to rule, alongside a king who had never truly chosen her at all. Declan Marsh, whose cooperation had ultimately led to Mira's rescue, received a lesser punishment, stripped of his rank, but permitted to remain within the pack under close watch, a mercy Cain extended reluctantly, weighing the value of his honesty against the severity of his initial betrayal. Once the hall had settled again, the weight of judgment lifted from the room. Cain turned to face the gathered pack members directly, and Mira felt her heart quicken at the shift in his expression, something warmer and more open than she had ever seen him wear in front of an audience before. "There is one more matter I wish to address tonight," he said, his eyes finding Mira across the crowded hall. "Many of you have watched, these past weeks, as an extraordinary bond formed between this pack's fiercest protector and a woman many of you knew only as a quiet servant, easily overlooked, rarely noticed. I confess, I did not understand it myself, at first. I questioned it, doubted it, sought explanations that made sense within the world I thought I understood." He stepped down from the high seat, crossing the hall slowly until he stood before her, Fenric shifting to allow him closer, without any trace of the old tension that had once defined every interaction between the wolf and anyone who dared approach. "What I have learned since," Cain continued, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the silent hall, "is that Mira Doyle carries within her blood an old and rare gift, a connection to wolves passed down through a lineage nearly lost to fear and time, one our own histories nearly forgot entirely existed. But more than that, I have learned that she carries a courage and a kindness that asks nothing in return, that reached a broken, wounded creature this pack had given up on healing, and gave him, for the first time in his life, a reason to trust again." Mira's breath caught in her chest, aware suddenly of every eye in the hall fixed upon her, though, for once, the weight of that attention did not frighten her the way it once might have. "I do not believe that kind of courage and kindness is something this pack should ever risk losing again," Cain said, turning fully to face her now, something soft and certain in his expression that made her heart ache with a hope she had barely allowed herself to feel until this very moment. "Mira Doyle, I am asking you, before this entire pack, to stand beside me, not simply as the woman a wolf chose to trust, but as the woman I have chosen for myself, as my Luna, if you will have me." The hall erupted into stunned murmurs, though beneath the surprise, Mira could hear something warmer building as well. Quiet approval spreading through gathered elders and warriors who had watched, over these past difficult weeks, exactly what kind of person this overlooked servant girl had proven herself to be. Mira looked at Cain, at the sincerity written plainly across his face, stripped entirely of the guarded authority he wore so carefully most days, and then down at Fenric, who sat calmly between them, silver eyes bright with something that looked, unmistakably, like quiet approval of his own. "Yes," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes, joy blooming warm and unfamiliar through her chest after a lifetime of quiet, unremarkable invisibility. "Yes, I will stand beside you." The hall broke into genuine celebration then, warriors and elders alike raising their voices in approval, the weight of weeks of suspicion and danger finally lifting into something brighter and more hopeful than Mira had ever imagined possible, for a girl who had once cleaned kennels for scraps of bread and expected nothing more from her life than quiet, unnoticed survival. Fenric rose and pressed himself between them, his massive head resting briefly against Mira's side and then against Kane's, as though claiming them both, finally, fully, as the family he had never before believed himself capable of having. Mira laughed through her tears, resting a hand on his head, the other reaching for Kane's, and felt, for the first time in her entire life, the true and lasting warmth of belonging somewhere completely, wanted not for what she could offer or what use she served, but simply for who she had always been. In the months that followed, the story of the servant girl and the Warwolf who knelt before her spread far beyond the borders of Ashwood territory, carried by traders and travelers into neighboring lands, growing with each retelling into something closer to legend. But within the pack itself, those who had witnessed it firsthand remembered it simply as the truth, a quiet reminder that even the most feared and broken among them could still be reached by kindness freely given, and that the smallest, most overlooked among any pack, might carry within them a strength and a worth far greater than anyone had ever thought to imagine. Mira Doyle, once invisible, once unnoticed, became Luna of Ashwood Pack, not through power seized or position schemed for, but through the simple, steady courage of showing kindness to a creature the world had given up on, and in doing so, she found not only a home she had never truly had before, but a family, in every sense that mattered, standing loyally beside her for the rest of her days.